Good afternoon and welcome to EHR Hosting Strategies, exploring the pros and cons of new options, a health system CIO Media Inc. production sponsored by Hewlett Packard Enterprise and Intel. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the editor-in-chief of Health Systems CIO, and I will be your moderator today. We're looking forward to your participation. A couple of ways you can do that. You can send in your questions and comments in the Q&A box. Those are welcome at any time. We'll take those later in the program, and we're going to do a little poll later in the event, and we will have our panelists guess at the results before we reveal them. So that should be fun. Nice way to view the screen today. You click in the top center, get it in side-by-side mode. Then you can adjust the divider to get the slides and the video boxes the size you want. And where it says speak, it should say speaker view in the top right-hand corner. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, we're going to about 35 to 40 minutes with our main panel featuring Jim Brady, VP Information Security and Infrastructure and CISO with Fairview Health Services. Kory Hudson, Director of Information Systems with Singing River Health Systems, and Aivars Apsite, Healthcare Practice Manager with HPE. So let's jump right into the discussion. It's going to be an interesting one today. Jim, let's start with you. Can you give me an overview of your organization and your role?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the event. I'm currently, as Anthony said, the CISO and the VP of Infrastructure and Security. The organization did an interesting thing. They merged infrastructure, that VP role, and the security role into one. So I've got a really great opportunity to bring the infrastructure group and security together and get more stuff done. Fairview Health Services is part of what we call mHealth Fairview, which is a partnership between University of Minnesota Medical School, the University of Minnesota Physician Group, and then Fairview Health System, which actually merged with Health East System. So we actually are two health systems, Fairview and Health East, so we go by the name of Fairview. And we're doing a big EHR merging between the two instances. So we'll talk more about that, I think, as we go through the program here. And we've got about 12 hospitals, 56 primary care clinics, 36 pharmacies, serving primarily the Minneapolis metropolitan area, and about a $6 billion revenue, and about 38,000 employees. So happy to be on the program and looking forward to a great discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. Kory?
Yes, welcome everyone. I'm Kory Hudson. I'm the Director of Information Systems here at Singing River Health System. We're now a 3-hospital health system over 2 counties in southern Mississippi, right here on the beautiful Gulf Coast. We've got 2 major outpatient centers, probably about 50 clinics across the coast, and about $2 billion in revenue. We have 3,000 employees, and my role is over all IT, so applications and infrastructure, security, and again, glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kory. Aivars?
Yes, hello. My name is Aivars Apsite. I'm a healthcare practice manager working on the HPE healthcare team. What I primarily do is I obviously interact with a lot of customers and position our solutions to those customers. I also manage the HPE Epic Systems relationship, and that's partial due because I actually was in Jim's and Kory's role for about 9 years, where I worked at a health system where we used Epic as our EHR, and I moved through the ranks of manager into senior leadership up at that health system. So I now speak to both sides of the fence, if you will. So, and this topic specifically is one of great interest, not to me, but obviously our team.
Very good, Aivars. Thank you very much. All right, Kory, we're going to start with you. Where is your EHR hosted today? What do you like about it, and what would you change?
So our EHR is not hosted. It's something that we've investigated many times over the last 8 years now that we've been on Epic. And given the size of our organization, we could not justify, and we'll certainly go into some more details, I think, as we talk through this today, Hard to justify, I think, some of the added expenditure given the size of our organization. Would I like that to change? I think if the cost structure would come down, I think it would be, I think advantageous. But as of today, we're not hosted.
Very good, Jim.
Yeah, so we're on premise also at Fairview, and I mentioned the two EHR, so both of those are on premise. And I do want to quickly mention that my previous role was CIO at LA County Department of Health Services, so we had Cerner hosted. Prior to that, I was at Kaiser Permanente as a CIO, and we were on premise with Epic. Cedars-Sinai on premise, they're also with Epic. And then we hosted Siemens Sorian, which is now under Cerner, when I worked at as a CISO and a CTO at White Health System. So I've got a little bit of both experience from both worlds there, for hosted and non-hosted. What I like about being what's on premise, obviously performance and latency is good. That's kind of what the cloud providers are, private or public, are trying to are shooting for. It's the technology and the security to support that is kind of known by the IT staff. So it's I think when you go to cloud, it becomes a little bit fuzzier, and so there's not a comfort level there. You have a lot if you have control over your analysts and you're doing everything on prem, let's say the resources, rather than having the EHR hosting vendor manage that, then you have a lot more control over the build, the configuration, and so I think it engages the staff a lot more once you start outsourcing that to remote hosting. You lose control, and so it can have kind of unintended consequences. Now, what I think I would like to change, definitely knowing that we're moving more towards a cloud and architecture, it's just way too expensive. We have about 1,200 servers just in the production, and then another 1,200 servers, just for backup and recovery. So that's a lot of money. That's very expensive. So if there's a way to cut into that and just spin up that backup, DR when you need it. So, how can we cut the cost? I think we got to deal with something like that. And then one other thing real quick I want to mention is what we do in healthcare, and I think there was a survey that went out that found that most of the downtimes, I think with 85% of Epic downtimes, are as a result of the customer trying to troubleshoot the issue rather than just failing over to their DR backup. So we have certain practices and methods where we like to get in and fix things, and that causes a lot of downtime to our clinicians. So I think, if we could move to as we move to the cloud and change that paradigm, I think it'll ultimately improve the clinical end user experience.
But you're saying today you don't like the cost structure of what you're currently doing.
No, because it's very expensive. I have to basically duplicate my infrastructure for Epic, and that's over 1,000 servers are just sitting there in the event that we need to go to DR.
Mm-hmm.
So
definitely.
So to not have that, this would be great. That's a lot of money.
Right.
Of course, there's challenges with which we can talk about more on. How do you get the cloud providers, either public or private, to meet the minimum requirements of Epic, Cerner, Meditech? I mean, right now we're not quite there yet, so we can probably start running DR in the cloud. So this, if you as far as public cloud, and if you do the on-prem hyper-converged private cloud, then obviously you kind of don't have to worry about that because it's right there, fast, it's running locally. So just some challenges.
Aivars, your thoughts?
Well, the thoughts is, I like what Jim was actually speaking to. He's actually speaking to some of the initiatives that we're hearing from many other customers, is that they're concerned about not only the burdening costs. I mean, it seems to get larger, and Epic itself keeps getting larger. And you got to somehow figure out how to fund that, because you got to keep everything up to speed, up to date, and on Epic's target platform. And Kory, interesting that you also spoke to, why on-prem really, makes sense for you guys, especially with a 3-hospital system. What I like to add though is the whole purpose of this discussion is, moving to service-related approaches. In other words, what makes sense? Jim, you mentioned disaster recovery, and there are disaster recovery as a services now being offered. And this is an intriguing parameter as health systems now start wrestling with the cost structure, but also services, and then how they're managing, the data sovereignty, data governance, all of that component, while yet also wanting to leverage new technologies that provide it as a service. So I'm very interested in how this conversation is going to evolve today. So back to you, Anthony.
Kory, any thoughts on what Aivars said?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, there's a dichotomy there where you start to talk about backups or disaster recovery as a service versus, hosting your EHR, your production environment for everyday use, like Jim was talking about. So, when we've looked at, purchasing compute from Microsoft or AWS or any number of data centers, you've got to take into account your redundant circuits that have to be purchased to go to that data center. You have to talk about, storage and processing power. You have to meet, minimum requirements. Now, our EMR vendor offers a hosting service, but they will only host the EMR. They won't host, our other applications. And we're managing about 500 or 600 servers ourselves. And so in a redundant infrastructure, we potentially could, I think, benefit from some cost savings with disaster recovery as a service. But once you scale your data centers, then, I don't know. I mean, I think you end up having enough capacity to do disaster recovery, especially when you have multi-locations and you can build out, multiple data centers depending on geographic area and distance between sites.
Yeah, if I could just add real quick to Kory, your comment. So I think ideally we ultimately would like to get out of the data center business, because as long as you have some stuff in the data center, you still have to pay for all that big iron, power, cooling. So it's a lot of money.
Yep.
So I think that's really important. And then another thing to think about also is if you're getting something that's more of a software as a service, EHR as a service, I think we may talk about that. You're and we are moving towards a standard build, where we had in the early days, EHRs were super customized. Now they're, people are accepting more of the standard build and workflow. Then you get the benefit of getting the latest and greatest. And you don't have to keep pouring in more staff and resources to build that and to support it. So I think being, if you're a small, medium organization, to be able to stay up on the, have the most features, the clinicians are going to, that are working reliably, they're going to appreciate it. I think if you're larger, the concern is you drag around a lot of balls and chains of just, older legacy functionality. It's so hard to, as I worked at Kaiser Permanente, that's a huge organization, 600 clinics, 39 hospitals. It would take us literally 3-4 years to just kind of get to all the facilities for, infrastructure updates and things. So, so there's a lot to be said with being able to have somebody do something really well. And then we focus on healthcare. And so I think I think our topic here on private cloud, public cloud, I think in hosting is we're in a transition. There's a process, we have to get to it, and different ones of us, depending on our specific situation, maybe size might be one criteria. We're going to take different first steps. And I think taking that first step is important, because we got to kick the tires. We got to move in that direction,
Another thing I'd point out too real quick, and I'm sorry, it was just real quick, that it also depends on the part of the country you're in too. So we've noticed we've got a couple of applications that are actually hosted outside of our organization, and internet connection is an issue. And there was an issue in our region where, and we're on AT&T here, where there was an outage in our multi-state area. And so If we were to go, I think it was 4 hours that it was out. If we were down for 4 hours, it would be devastating.
Like so again, and just to add to yeah, actually to both the comments, there is a lot of interest in how to leverage the newer capabilities of cloud, and where HP and I know our competitors are even looking at us. How do we help with that? And from HP, we got some questions coming on. I'll be very interested in Jim, you already mentioned the hybrid private cloud and how that might really play in that as a strategy to enable or facilitate those cloud adoptions. I didn't say cloud migrations, that's cloud adoptions, cloud integrations, because I really believe that's where the industry is going to go. You're going to still maintain apps on-prem, as you spoke to Kory, but at the same time leverage cloud-like experiences that are both on-prem and in the cloud. So I don't want to take some of the thunder here away from you, Anthony, but I think that's where I'm really interested in getting feedback from both you, Kory and Jim.
All right, we'll make sure we get there. We'll make sure we get there. Jim, I'm going to start with you on the next question. What are your thoughts on the viability of on-prem private cloud as an EHR hosting strategy?
Okay. Yeah. So my thoughts on that is, I think it's a viable first step for certain organizations. Maybe like Kory mentioned, if you're rural and you don't have the connectivity. I know we're all looking upwards to the clouds for SpaceX and Blue Origins to solve all of our problems with satellite, internet connectivity, and probably will happen. I heard it's actually going to get down to as low as 15 millisecond. It's not going to be enough for running an EHR, but so I think it's definitely a good step. I think it's a good step for organizations that just really haven't even thought about the cloud, and they, maybe culturally they're not open to like just immediately throwing everything into GCP or AWS or Azure. And I think there's a lot of great things that's, gives you the flexibility. I mean, to be able to just keep that same experience, that same, what they call control plane, like if you did something like VMware on AWS, you're just taking all of your VMware infrastructure without going to EC2 and S3 and just, having to learn cloud. You can just take it and run it on, in this case, AWS. So I think there's that familiarity that's helpful. To be able to do the charge-based consumption, I think that's great, because I haven't explored myself the actual cost of, like how much would I save if I ran it on-prem private cloud versus I just kind of did my own infrastructure versus I did it in the, let's just say I went to one of the larger cloud providers. Yeah, and then there are, from what I'm told, Aivars, I know you're the expert in this, but there are options for the financial fiddling where you can say, I want this to be capitalized and I want that to be OpEx. And so you can kind of like massage it a little bit. So there's flexibility. And I know that's important because sometimes there's OpEx, sometimes there's CapEx, and some organizations, they want you to put licensing under CapEx. Other times they want you to do that. In other organizations, that goes under it goes under the opposite one. So I think that for large organizations, I think this is kind of what's going on with us is we're looking at that, but we're also looking at what is the long-term roadmap with viability for a full cloud deployment on a major cloud provider, and is that doable? Right now, it's not doable for Epic, although I think that they're working really hard and coming pretty quick on that. So I think the next year or so, we might see some prod instances actually on the cloud based on conversations I had. Certainly, as we talked about, DR and this is public cloud. So I think that to answer your question, Anthony, I think private cloud is definitely a viable option as a first step, and that's in health systems. We like to rush in and do things at high risk, right?
Yeah.
So
we're
not necessarily high risk people. So I think it's good. It's a great place to start, and it should be explored. If you're not looking at it, my encouragement is to at least look at it.
Kory?
Yes, I mean, I think there's some viability to on-prem private cloud. Certainly, I think there's probably a niche for certain types of organizations. The larger the organization, the more you can scale up, and even some of the major players in the cloud business, you could probably, gain economies of scale there. Mid-sized organization like ours, I think it's viable economically, but given, I think, some of the challenges that we face, depending, again, like I said, where you're located, I think offer different types of challenges, and certainly, and I think it's in the mid-sized space, because I think the smaller you are, the more you might pay for, these as services, like Aivars was referring to earlier. So a lot of smaller organizations aren't using as much technology in their facilities, especially like federally qualified healthcare facilities. They're running an EHR, they may have some medical devices, but they're not very big. And so, cloud as a service, I think, is very viable.
Hey, can I just add something really quick to Kory, what you said? So I know that there's a lot of organizations that are just not doing anything in this space, public cloud, private cloud. They're just kind of waiting around to read more stories in health system CIO and watch webinars about what's going on. So I think there's a great opportunity, if there's that many people just kind of hanging around, to go out proactively and get those conversations. And this would be Aivars and those that that would have that kind of a model, because because there's very few people that are moving actively in this direction. I know that I was talking to AWS, and there's one client in New York City that's got all their disaster recovery on the cloud now, and they're thinking next year early about going on the prod side when they can get all the hardware and everything working. But those are just a few of the front runners. So there's a big opportunity to talk and bring this conversation up, and it might be. I think it's a great first step. And eventually, at some point, I know that the hyper-converged, Superdome HP GreenLake solution does tie into all the other cloud providers. So I think we'll all be one giant integrated matrix fabric at some point. But I think that because people aren't actively on the edge, even looking seriously about it, then I think there's an opportunity to have those conversations. And then rather than just wait for them to come to you, wait for customers on the healthcare provider side to come to you, which I know that you guys are going to do that. So.
One giant integrated matrix fabric. That sounded very sci-fi.
Well, it's the Blue Origin, SpaceX. Maybe if Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk adopts that, it'll get a little bit more socialized.
Very good. Aivars?
Well, what's interesting, Jim, is you've hit upon really my next step is education. And when we approached Anthony, you went, hey, this is an interesting topic. Let's talk about it more. This topic really isn't being discussed even among peers. I mean, we did a Chime survey, which probably not supposed to say that, but anyways, we did a survey.
That's okay.
And had interesting results on from that survey. Basically, just literally, they all smack on what both Jim and Kory you're hitting on, and this topic just isn't really talked about. And we have. I'm not making this a sales pitch, but we have solutions that we feel are very apropos and very essential for healthcare IT to at least consider and adopt along these lines. And another question I know Anthony's going to ask is spectrum along that even more. So. It's just that we're starting these conversations. So first of all, thank you for the platform, Anthony. And second of all, Jim and Kory, thank you for just being transparent and starting these dialogues.
Well, Aivars, let me ask you, we've heard Jim definitely talking about, and Kory as well, they seem to indicate that there might be a greater comfort level the smaller you are, or it's easier to do these things, make these transitions to the cloud, the smaller you are. And as you get larger and larger, it becomes more challenging or more not as appropriate. What are your thoughts there, Aivars? Do you see that as well, or do you sort of disagree on some level?
Not necessarily disagree, but maybe expanding the perspective, because we're seeing, at least from a consumption model, from the smallest to the very largest organizations embrace it. Small organizations say that they don't scale as much. The large organizations actually get it, but they're concerned about actually managing scale at an operational level even. So yeah, the CapEx OpEx discussions become real. But it's a perspective issue. And this is the opportunity to explain from at least a vendor perspective, the on-prem private cloud, at least from HPE's perspective, it's your solution, but it's on premises. But therefore, we deliver an on-prem solution, but to you, it's funded like a private cloud. It's a cloud-like experience on premises. So the same way how you would maybe even position cloud funding for an application, the goal is to bring that to you on premise so you can start with that experience of not only paying only for what you use, but having the performance and the scalability that you'd expect out of a cloud, but also on-prem, being able to fund it appropriately, and then also bring in that management level, bring that oversight that allows you to provide that elasticity into the cloud when you're ready. Some move very quickly into cloud services that provide things like DR as a service and other backups. Others are much more cautious and slow. So we can actually enable that transition, if you will, that transformation at your speed, not at a actual cloud provider speed or hyperscaler speed. They drive that. We work with you at your speed. That's the whole promise of an on-prem private cloud. And it isn't just EHR, it's also all your application ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Did that help explain?
I think so. And when we get to our co-panelist questions, I'd be interested to see what Jim and Kory have for you to learn more about what you're developing and what you're thinking.
Get ready.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. Trying to figure out what people need and in what structure and what manner and what billing. And there also seems to be in a mode of experimenting and trying things out, considering things. So you have both sides trying to find that common ground. And maybe that's what we'll be able to do here today. Next question, Aivars, I want to start with you. Is the concept of EHR as a service a viable EHR hosting strategy? I'm guessing you're going to say yes to that.
Wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
But yet at the same time, this is something new that we're obviously not only experiencing but implementing as a solution.
Mm-hmm.
The reason where this concept is obviously, just look at Cerner. Cerner pretty much is fully hosted in their data centers. Epic offers actually two types of hosting. They offer their own hosting. Typically, it's the smaller, but there's some larger health systems within Epic's hosted service. But Epic also offers their Community Connect solution, so they can offer, the ability for a large physician group or even a smaller hospital to leverage that health system's EHR implementation for their own. Okay, and then we run into some now competitive EHR as a service options out there. I'm not going to mention their competitors, but they are also offering, and so we're saying, this is a viable solution because I think Jim, you mentioned, you're looking at that complexity matrix. You're looking at those resources you need to devote to supporting that organization. Well over 1,000 servers. How can you do that better? And what the EHR as a service, to define that, is a solution that promotes not only the infrastructure management capabilities, but the EHR technical platform management. So that becomes now bundled into a service where we help provide that ability to support that technology stack from the EHR technology stack down through the infrastructure, and then you still manage the actual application itself, the clinical workflows, all of the implementation, the configuration, such and so forth. And even if you want to get out of that, we can start talking to you about how that can be adapted. But again, let's baby steps. Let's first talk about how you'd even affect that transition. That's the EHR as a service, and then what those services entail. And we're starting with the infrastructure, and then so for example, for Epic, it is the pure Epic technical stack. We provide the ODB certified resources for both cache iris, and also for the relational databases, the presentation tier stack, and then also the web tier and service server tiers. We'd also provide those resources that are certified and manage that for you. We have RACIs already developed. The whole 9 yards will be implemented as a cloud-like service, but it's all on-prem or in colos. And then we can start working with even the colo adjacencies of actually hyperscaler integrations with, like AWS or Azure, more probably for Epic, more Azure related integrations at the cloud adjacency level. So a lot of words, but it's hard to describe EHR as a service in about 4 sentences.
Kory, what are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. I mean, there are hundreds of companies out there right now that offer this level of service. And to Aivars' point, it's not just about the infrastructure, the data center and renting space, if you will. You can certainly do that, but that's not EHR as a service, is it? So, these vendors, they've got to have all the resources that Aivars was referring to. The technical staff. You have Epic Technical, which manages the cache database and hyperspace, and certainly then you need your network layer and telecom layer support. So no, and there are tons of vendors that do this as well. So when we talked about on-prem private, I guess I could consider myself in that space just because we also offer Epic as a service in our Community Connect program. We've got about 40 plus clinics private that aren't part of Senior River Health System that use our instance of Epic, and they pay us to provide the software, the service. We upgrade it. We do all the service level that Aivars was referring to. So very viable, and a lot of Epic customers are doing that. I've talked to colleagues about other EMRs who are on EHR as a service. It kind of goes back to what Jim was talking about. Whether or not you're getting that 15 milliseconds of response time can be slow depending on the EMR that you're using. So those are the things that are kind of the big challenges and the big concerns, but definitely EHR as a service it's here today. It's viable because there are hundreds of vendors that offer this service.
Jim?
Yeah, so I think my answer is going to be slightly different. Excuse me. So I think it kind of depends. I think my definition of EHR as a service, or EAAS, nobody's going to find that, is really like it's like IaaS, infrastructure as a service. That's all the gear, hardware. Then there's platform as a service, and then function as a service. As we get to serverless computing, then if you keep going up the stack, then there's software as a service, which really the EHR is a software offering. And so right now, because at least with Epic, okay, let me just back up real quick. So Cerner, as I think Aivars mentioned, a lot of their customers are remote hosted. I think 85% of all Cerner customers are remote hosted at this point, but that's just them using on-prem methodologies. And then they're managing basically the customer's data center for their EHR. So I think a lot of people confuse remote hosting with, cloud. So I think getting back to the EHR as a service, that's, in my mind, that's just a true cloud-based EHR. So that means it's got to be supported, the whole stack in the cloud. And so right now, because of latency issues, and then with global reference requirements, which I think I know Epic has, I think you need about 13 or 15 million. And I know that right now there isn't the ability to run the full cache, InterSystems cache database in a public cloud instance. But soon, I think they are developing the technology to get this done with faster CPUs and cores and things. So right now, you'd have to almost go with hyper-converged on-premise if you're gonna actually be the one to kind of host it. So I guess I'm just speaking from the actual hosting entity. So I think that but as I mentioned before, there's, I think we're seeing the large cloud providers, that's where their core function is to drive down cost and really give you a scalability and high availability with multiple regions and things. Those are the things that ultimately at the end of the day are going to probably be the lower cost. I haven't done the math, but I'm just thinking that it's got to those large economies of scale have got to drive down costs. So is it possible to do that with private cloud to get that low and to drive that cost if we can meet all the minimum requirements on the technical side? And so, like I said, we're not there yet, but I guess I'm not thinking that. And Aivars, you can go ahead and challenge me on that one, but I don't know whether or not that it's possible to get the price point that low. And at the end of the day, if you can get the availability, you can get the performance, the round trip time, it's acceptable. I think hyperspace has to be 7 milliseconds, and I know that a major cloud provider now can do it in 5 milliseconds. And so people are going to probably end up going eventually to the lower cost option. So, and just to correct something I said a second ago, when I said that private cloud is a good step for small and medium, I think definitely large. There's a lot of large systems that they have a hard time changing anything, and so getting something to get them to take a step forward would be awesome. And so I think that there's a great opportunity with the large systems because it takes forever to get stuff done. We're not fully there yet with the large cloud providers, and so I think it's a great first step. So I didn't mean to just say it's only for the smaller, medium organizations. Anyway, so I think that it is a viable strategy. I think we're in the middle of an evolution right now, and it'd be really cool to see how it kind of pans out and when will it fully, materialize and we can get some momentum.
Anthony, I want to add on both, Jim and Kory, you touched on something that I think is still kind of deep rooted in the thinking and psyche of a lot of IT leaders. As soon as you mention private cloud, and in the context of EHR as a service, the premise seems to go, it's in the cloud. And at least from HPE's perspective, our drive is, no, this is an on-prem solution. It's literally on your prem, it's in your data centers. Now, if you literally want to say, okay, day one, I want to get rid of my data centers, I'd ask you, how are you going to do that? Because that isn't an overnight decision. That's at least a year, if not longer, in transition planning. That's where the private cloud approach comes into play, but we deliver it on premise, and we can even then deliver the EHR technology stack service also as a service. It's turned over to us. So that's a point of just a definition, and then maybe an absorbing that definition that we're also. That's why I said it's an educational process for us, is to get the actual concept of the private cloud within your data centers, managed in a cloud-like manner that delivers not only the infrastructure, but then the EHR technology stack as a service. And that, definitely comes in. We could we actually even find that we can have price points that are very favorable because it's a consumption-only model, and you have resource sharing that we affect. And there's even ways how we can maybe transition your preferred technology resources into our solution space, because we can repatriate them and maybe offer them even more career path as this goes. You can see where maybe some resources may not have careers in the future, and we can get ahead of that curve by already offering them basically very promising careers in the future, but from more of the service side.
All right. Well, we're gonna go to a question. I know, Aivars, you were very curious about this, and it's a very important question. So, how does your health system fund your EHR hosting today, and might that change with a new EHR hosting strategy? Jim, let's start with you.
Okay. So I went ahead and quizzed my colleagues since I'm fairly new to the organization, so I don't know what our financial practices were, since they kind of do differ. So the EHR implementation was considered an organizational strategic project, and so we have a separate bucket of money outside of IT. It is capitalized, so basically our implementation for all the infrastructure, the implementation, the Epic licensing, and our initial analyst costs, those are all capitalized, and it came from an organizational kind of bucket of money. We didn't capitalize the PMs though. And then our ongoing kind of method is any growth events for licensing, any life cycle, those are all OpEx. So that's so we cover that out of IT. So, and then as far as the second part of the question, I don't know if it was, is it more or less costly, or Anthony, can you?
Aivars, you want to give them some color around the information you're curious
Yeah,
about?
so obviously, as you're considering a new EHR strategy, and hosting it, whether you do it on-prem or in the cloud or somewhere in between, whether it's on-prem, private cloud, would you change your funding vehicles to pay for that new hosting strategy? And I'm using hosting as far as running either
I
at the
got it. All
on-prem
right.
or running it in the cloud.
Yeah. Well, first of all, money's a little tight right now, just in general. So we're challenged. We're trying to address a certain shortfall. So we have a plan to do that. But what's awesome is the organization, the board of directors, executives. They understand that technology is kind of like the spinal cord or the vertebrae. It's the core thing. So we need to make sure that we continue to keep that moving. But whether we did hosting or not, any initial project like that implementation, those licensing, if we switched over to, let's just say, private cloud or else public cloud, it would all be capitalized on the initial components. That's kind of how we do it at Fairview.
Kory?
No, it's very similar for us too. We're a not-for-profit government entity, actually. So there are rules to how we spend money, and licensing. So currently, the way we purchased our EHR 9 years ago now, there were licenses that had to be purchased, and with the licenses, it wasn't just EHR licenses. It also had to do with whatever other infrastructure and technology you were going to implement with the solution. And so, things like licenses is capitalized. Usually implementation can be capitalized. Training, depending, might be capitalized. A big project like this, you could even capitalize, contractors, consultants, what have you, labor, if you will. But we don't externally host our EHR with anybody, with any vendor. And so ongoing support and maintenance, that's an OpEx. How might that change with a new EHR hosting strategy? So, when you think about solutions, you either own it, and it's perpetual, or you're paying like a subscription, which is the SaaS model. And so SaaS model could change depending on how they structure the contract, but I think of SaaS as subscription, and that's typically OpEx, right? So our capital bucket is separate. It's institutional. It's we even have to, because of our board, and we are owned by the county. We've got to follow rules about how we develop our capital plan, how we execute on the capital plan, and we've got tight rules around, we don't have just this bucket of nebulous money that we can do whatever we want with. We've got specific solutions tied to that money. And if we want to institute something different than what we put forth in the plan, then we've actually got to find substitutions, right? We don't have some catch-all bucket of money to spend. And so on the flip side of capital is your operational budget, and most likely a hosting strategy is a service. And that's the way, to me, that's the way I would view it. And any services would just have to be budgeted within an OpEx model. And so, that's currently our strategy today.
Aivars, did that get to what you're wondering? What are you thinking? What are your concerns here what are you trying to figure out?
We hear that a lot. We hear the CapEx story, we hear the OpEx story with the licensing and the ongoing support. The transition between moving from a on-prem solution to a cloud solution invariably speaks to a divide between how do you move from CapEx to an OpEx model. Does that make sense to both you, Jim and Kory?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, it's just that any project we would do of any scale, we're going to capitalize it. So the migration, all the stuff that's involved in going to, let's just say, to the cloud, whether it's public or private, would still be capitalized. It'd still be a strategic project for us. It would be at the organizational level. It wouldn't come out of IT. And I think we'd want to know what's the return on investment, what is the true savings, and we would be looking also at knowing that the other larger players are also gearing up for public cloud viability with some of the big EHR vendors. What does that look like, and do we need the interim step, or can we start working with the large public cloud providers?
Yeah.
So it's kind of looking at what's going to give us the most cost savings, and then without interrupting patient care. So I think that's kind of what we're looking at this point.
Strategically, I would say, it depends on the scope of the project. So, I mean, if it's a large institutional project like this would inevitably be, there could be some capitalized components, but I can tell you, going forward from year to year, budget-wise, would be an operational expense. It would be this thing where, we might capitalize labor, contractors. There could be some licensing depending on, who your hosting vendor is. But, if we're truly buying a service from a vendor who's also going to support the EHR themselves, that's a service to us, and that's an operational expense. And I would end up budgeting for that annually, multi-year, whatever, in my strategic process.
So you touched on the actual, challenges themselves, but then the actual challenge that we're finding, at least the vendors, is health systems want to do that, but getting to all the right players to, engage them in that financial discussion, because you both mentioned, the actual CapEx funding comes outside of your IT department. That's actually typically your board level and CFO level discussion. You got banking covenants, you got, fiduciary responsibilities that the board owns, if you will.
Right.
And that's got to be now transitioned for a very large initiative. Basically your core EHR system is going to be, held in a transition from a CapEx model eventually to some form of a hybrid CapEx OpEx, or maybe eventually an OpEx model. How do those conversations start, and how are those held? That's the challenge that we have, because too many times we actually find, the senior leaders kind of almost hide behind, well, that's how we do it. That's just how we always done it. But yet the market's going to an OpEx model. How does that transition happen? Kory, you're smiling.
Yeah, I mean, the process always starts with me. So I'll tell you that strategically across the board, year to year, I am always looking to reduce costs. Everybody knows the challenges in healthcare. You're pressed on both sides, right? You're pressed by the payer, you're pressed by the vendors that you deal with. And so ultimately, it's hard for you it's very tricky to navigate that line. And so ultimately, I end up doing, and it could be a multi-year process where I've got to do some due diligence on figuring out all of my current costs today, my depreciated assets in terms of, things I've already bought, things that are in place. What's the life cycle of those products? How am I going to transition all of this? Because it's not just about the EHR, it's about everything also too that integrates with the EHR, that supports the EHR in terms of access and among other things. Is what does that cost structure look like? What is it going to look like in the cloud? With some of the vendor who's going to do most of this stuff, I might end up reducing staff, right? I might end up not needing as many, Citrix licenses or cache licenses, or, when we look at disaster recovery, that also could potentially be diminuted. And so in my process, I will go through a multi-step kind of process to look at that total cost structure, because to me, the benefit to going to host would need to lower my costs.
I agree.
And if I can present that to the board, as great and large of a project as that's going to be, I would outline that. I would present it as a strategic, in our strategic process, planning process, and ultimately it would get approved through, our IT steering committee, our board governance, and if there's significant benefit to doing that, it would get approved.
All right, listen, I want to get in an audience question. We're running out of time today, but let's see if, Aivars, let's throw this one to you. You might have the detail on this. What do most mid-size enterprises do that have ECW, eClinicalWorks, self-hosting or cloud hosting? In terms of costs, where do they stand comparatively to Cerner and Epic? You have any ideas on that, Aivars?
That's really going to be a harder question to answer. However, in my experience with the small to medium-sized health systems that use basically their contract for those EHRs, we find that most of them have already moved to an operational model, and how that compares to an EHR on-prem or not, or a cloud-hosted solution. I'm going to say that it depends on their scale. If they find themselves growing aggressively, 15, 20% over a year, there's definitely a compelling need for maybe looking at that service as non-prem, because again, you're adopting a consumption model. You're not forecasting your consumption 3, 4, or 5 years down the road. But if you find your growth very static and your current expenses pretty static, yeah, that's where maybe the play doesn't happen as much. So that's an interesting question. That does take some time to actually sit down with the customer and talk it through.
Kory or Jim, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I don't have any input on
Nothing on that. Kory?
eClinicalWorks.
So prior to the EHR we have today, we had multiple practices. We had different EHRs and different service lines, but we did have ECW in primary care, neurology, and I think one other specialty. And I'm not familiar with ECW in terms of whether or not they offer a hospital solution, maybe in the small market. But it's comparing to the big two, ECW is very economic. I'm not gonna, so yeah, it's very low cost. You can either, I don't know that ECW hosts, they may host themselves, but I've run into many vendors who actually support ECW outside of ECW, the company, as a service, in a private cloud or yeah, and they offer that as a service, and it's usually much less expensive than the big two.
All right, we're almost out of time. Aivars, I want to give you a brief opportunity to give a final thought to our listeners today. What's a message you want to leave them with?
A message I want to leave them with. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing, some of your actual strategies and thoughts on this newer thinking. And the thought I'd like to leave you with is, as you consider, your next path, or the path forward of how you're going to host your EHR and where you're going to host it, is maybe adopt a partnership approach and be open to maybe newer approaches to how a private cloud or how a on-prem solution can be leveraged in a cloud-like manner. That may or may not involve a variety of EHR augmented services that a vendor could deliver, partnering with you to help lower your costs and yet enable you to transition to a more ubiquitously supported EHR model that incorporates not only EHR but also all of your applications.
Excellent. Well, that's about all we had time for today regarding continuing education. You could use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when the on-demand recording of this incredible event if I must say so, is ready for viewing. If you want to sponsor an event with us, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team, and you can go to our website to register for upcoming events. With that, I want to thank our panel, Jim Brady, Kory Hudson, and Aivars Apsite, and I want to thank our sponsors, HPE and Intel, and I want to thank you, our attendees, for coming to our events. And with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.